Greetings, everyone. It is the Ambassador coming at you today with a brand new movie review from the 1980s, continuing our World Before It Went Woke movie review series. And today we will be discussing Airplane and Airplane 2, the sequel. And the reason I want to cover these two movies in particular is considering a lot of the tension and trouble that's been going on the last few days and everything in light of what's been going on overseas, in particular in Iran and Iraq and so on. I thought it might be nice to take a little bit of a breather, maybe laugh a little bit, and discuss an old 80s classic. And honestly, this movie does tie very much into the my World Before Wokeness or the World Before It Went Woke series because I don't think, honestly, you could have. I don't think modern Hollywood would allow a movie like this to be made because some of the humor, to be perfectly honest, is a little off color, to use an old term. And I don't. I want to kind of put in the same vein as some of the of Mel Brooks's earlier works, in particular Blazing Saddles, perhaps even Young Frankenstein, maybe, and History of the World Part 1. Because honestly, what we have with Airplane and Airplane 2, the sequel, is a lot of spoof and a lot of parody comedy. And that type of comedy does tend to lean, lean itself towards what we might call non PC humor. But I think that's one of the really great appealing things about Airplane and Airplane 2. Excuse me. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, still getting over a little bit of a cold. This crazy weather we've got around here. But the really funny thing about Airplane, I did not originally see this in theaters. I was honestly too young. It came out in 1980, and if I remember correctly, Airplane 2, the sequel, came out I think in 82 or 83, and I was only maybe 3 or 4 years old at the time. But I did have the opportunity, once I got old enough, to see Airplane on VHS. And I do, thanks to my wonderful in-laws, actually got me the Blu-ray copy of both Airplane and Airplane 2 for my birthday this past year. And to say that Airplane and its sequel are favorites of mine is an understatement. These movies, if you look at them as a duology, whatever way you want to term it, because they only did two movies. This was back in the 1980s where they didn't do 3 million sequels to a particular movie. They did one, maybe two, and they were done. But the interesting thing about Airplane is, as I've mentioned, is this was a parody of old airplane disaster movies that were very popular from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The funny thing about Airplane is it takes itself seriously sometimes, but at the same time, it doesn't take itself too seriously. And I know that might sound like a contradiction in terms. However, the interesting thing about Airplane was the fact that the writers and producers, two of which were brothers, and the other one was a best friend of the two brothers, actually got the script to an old, I think it was 1950s airplane disaster movie called 0 Hour. And they bought the script outright. And they actually got a copy of the original movie called 0 Hour, if memory serves. And they went through the entire movie and they went through the entire script. And they took bits and pieces from the script. Now, they adapted the major part of the script and everything, the original script for Airplane, from that other script and from the movie. But what they did was they sprinkled in the humor into it. And to say that the opening of this movie is iconic is an understatement. because you've got this very heavy, very dramatic music playing over the opening credits. And if I remember correctly, Elmer Bernstein, who was a big name composer and a score writer in Hollywood and everything, particularly in the 70s and 80s. I think even a little bit into the 90s, I don't recall exactly. This music does not exactly match up with the movie because it is very dramatic, it is very serious in tone, but the movie itself, it is through and through a comedy and a very irreverent one, and it does not at times pull any punches. And you have a top-notch cast of comedic actors and some actors who had never done comedy up until this movie. Um, you have Robert Hayes as Ted Stryker. You have Julie Haggerty as Elaine, the love interest. You have Peter Graves, who up until that point had done primarily Mission Impossible, the TV show. And this was his first foray into comedy, and some of the dialogue, to say it would be very triggering nowadays is an understatement. And Peter Graves was actually very worried about this because he had had a fairly decent career as a TV and movie actor up until this point, and he didn't want to ruin it. And the dialogue that they had him speak and everything in Airplane and in its sequel, it. Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. He's sitting in the cockpit of the plane, and the co-pilot is there, and the co-pilot is actually played by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was a very big name basketball player for the NBA back in the day. And I think he does a lot of commentating and so on nowadays and everything. I think he might even have a podcast or something like that on iTunes or whatever. And you've got the navigator and everything. The names of Peter Graves, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and the navigator is Captain Over, Roger Murdoch, and Victor Bosta. And there is an exchange towards the beginning of the movie when the plane is starting to take off, and you've got the pilot and the co-pilot communicating with the tower and the navigator, and there is just this exchange where everybody's going, "Huh? Who? What?" Because Peter Graves' character's name is Captain Over. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's name is Roger Murdoch. And as I said, the navigator's name was Victor Bosta. And if you know anything about airplane lingo or just radio lingo in general, the words Over, Roger, and Victor, or Vector, are rather common. But the interesting thing about this movie is you have a very interesting setup. And honestly, the same setup is kind of echoed in the sequel movie, but there are some changes done. But the funny thing about Airplane, as I mentioned, there are some dramatic elements to it, but it is by and large a comedy and is a parody of the old airplane disaster movies from way back in the day. And when I talk about airplane disaster movie, back in the 70s, and I do remember a few of these movies when they would be run on TV, like Airport 76 or Airport 77 and so on, where there would be some sort of mid-air catastrophe or incident with the crew or the passengers of some particular airline or whatever, or some oddball mechanical problem would go wrong with the plane and the crew would be incapacitated, and either the passengers or the rest of the crew, say the flight attendants, well, back in those days they were called stewardesses, but trying not to trigger anyone, although I don't imagine too much of my audience is the triggering kind. But what you have with the first Airplane is a strain of food poisoning goes throughout the entire aircraft, and the entire flight crew, minus the flight attendants, are all incapacitated. And Robert Hayes' character, Ted Stryker, who actually was a combat pilot in the military, and who was in charge of a mission that went very, very sideways, ends up in the cockpit of the plane. Although he has a terrible fear of flying, he has self-confidence issues, and he wants nothing to do with it. But you have another character played very well by Leslie Nielsen, who plays a doctor and everything, who discovers that it is in fact a strain of food poisoning that's making everybody sick. And on top of all this, you also have a young woman, a young girl, who is due for a heart transplant operation, and she's being transported on this same plane where all this other stuff is going haywire. But what ends up happening is the fact that you have Ted and Elaine, who actually were in a relationship prior to the events of the movie, and you get a few flashbacks as to when they first met and at certain points during their relationship, and you get everything. When you get to the opening of the movie, you get the indication that they have had a very bad falling out, and she's in fact leaving Ted. And this movie has a few fourth wall breaks, which I think were very well done. And this one of the most iconic ones, honestly. It's the very first exchange towards the beginning of the movie, and Ted and Elaine are talking in the hallway there at the airport, and she's like, "I can't be with a man that I can't respect," and she says it very whiny and very irritatingly. And Robert Hayes' character looks at the camera and says, "What a pisser." In other words, what a pisser, whiner, and moaner that she is. And he's not entirely wrong. But what ends up happening throughout the course of the movie is you have the late Lloyd Bridges, who plays the flight controller at the airport, who's kind of in charge of all the operations. And if you all have not had a chance to see Airplane, I'm going to go ahead and just say this now. Go get you a copy or see if it's on digital and watch it. Because, as I said, right now, laughter is the best medicine we have. And that's the truth of it. And another great performance that's given in this movie and everything is also by the late Robert Stack. For those of you who might not be familiar with him, he did a lot of TV work before he became well known for his part in Airplane. He was I think his most well known part was actually in the TV show The Untouchables, where he plays Elliot Ness. And in Airplane, he actually plays Ted Stryker's former commander, Rex Kramer. And Kramer is there in the airport, in the control center, trying to talk Ted through the process of getting the plane safely landed. And Kramer, at one point, just one of their very first exchanges, he's like, "Oh, to hell with this. We'd be better off and everything just directing him into Lake Michigan. At least we would save a lot of lives and everything in the long run." But what ends up happening is Ted, by some stroke of luck, well, not so much stroke of luck, but he has a conversation with the doctor, played by Leslie Nielsen, towards the end of the movie. And he gives, Leslie Nielsen's character, gives this very rousing speech and everything to Stryker, and it gives Stryker the confidence to go back into the cockpit and successfully land the plane and save everybody on board. Although the landing is not the prettiest, as the old saying goes, it isn't how you land the plane, it's the question of whether it reaches the ground safely. And the plane and everybody on board does reach the ground safely. But that all being said, I love Airplane. I don't know how many times I have watched it, and to this very day, it's still hilarious. So I do highly recommend this movie, and I do recommend the sequel. And we are going to talk about the sequel for a few minutes here, because you can't talk about the original without talking about the sequel. Now, I don't know exactly what happened and everything. I don't know if the sequel wasn't as popular or if people just thought it was contrived or whatever. But it's not as well known as the original. Of course, oftentimes a sequel is never as good as the original. But Airplane 2, the sequel, and that's the title of it. There's no long, drawn out, bibbity blobbity subtitle to it. It's simply Airplane 2, the sequel. And if the interesting thing was, this takes place in the early to mid '80s, when Airplane 2, the sequel, was released. And if I recall correctly, it was released through Paramount and everything. And I think Paramount at the time was also co-producing the TV show Babylon 5. Or Babylon 5, excuse me, Battlestar Galactica. Got Babylon 5 on the brain. But no, Paramount was, I think, co-producing, or was the main producing studio behind Battlestar Galactica. Because they actually use the music from the opening crawl and everything for Battlestar Galactica in Airplane 2, the sequel. And actually, it does sort of fit, because you even have an opening crawl for Airplane 2, homage to Star Wars, in the opening scene of the movie. And then, of course, you have, this movie is supposed to take place in the distant future, where we have colonized the moon, and this is the first commercial space flight to the moon and what have you. And it's a great setup, honestly. I mean, there are similar beats to Airplane 2, the sequel, and the original Airplane, but it's still got enough originality, enough freshness to it that it's still hilarious. And the long and short of it is, Ted Stryker once again ends up on the space flight. But however, this time he's gotten over his fear of flying, and he was actually offered, in years after his successful rescue or successful landing of the flight that he was on and everything in the first airplane, to work on the space shuttle project and everything, the first commercial space shuttle project. But what ends up happening is that the company that is backing the construction and development of the commercial spacecraft, they use a lot of substandard wiring and what have you. And instead of going back and trying to make things right, they pin all the mechanical malfunctions on Stryker, and he ends up getting put into a mental institution. And pretty much the company completely just ruins Stryker's reputation. And you see Elaine. I think. Well, it was Julie Haggerty who played Elaine. I think her last name was Elaine Dickinson. I could be off on that. If y'all recall exactly, comment down below. Let me know. But she's with another fellow played by Chad Everett and everything. And Chad Everett was a pretty good TV actor back in the 80s. And I think he might have even been in a few of the airplane disaster movies I had mentioned previously. But what we have with Airplane 2, the sequel, is this takes place in the future. And you've got the opening montage at the, well, in this case, it's not an airport, it's a space center and everything, where all these different passengers come and go back and forth. And one particular bit that they have is they have an information desk. And all these various people come up and ask this information director or customer service person or anything all these random questions. Like one guy asks, "What's the fastest animal on the earth?" And the guy says, "The cheetah." And another person asks, "How long is my parking permit good for?" And the guy says, 2 hours. And then you have this other woman walk up and everything, and she leans on the car and she's like, "Should I fake my orgasms?" And the guy says, "Yes, you should." And she's like, "Gee, thank you." And walks off very pleased. And As I've said before, with the airplane movies, there is a lot of what would be considered triggering humor for this day and age, but honestly, I think triggering humor is probably the best, considering what we had going on Sunday night at the Golden Globes with Mr. Rick Gervais. But there's a lot of callbacks to other different movies. There's a callback to 2001: A Space Odyssey because there is an artificial intelligence computer that does run the shuttle. You do have some musical cues and everything from 2001. Obviously, like I said, you have the opening crawl from Star Wars. You've got the music that they have that they are reusing from Battlestar Galactica. You do have some of the original actors from the first airplane return. You have Peter Graves return as Captain Over. You've also got Robert Hayes return as Ted Stryker, Julie Haggerty as Elaine Dickinson. You do have Lloyd Bridges reprise his role as the flight controller. And I will say this. There is one other set of spoof movies that Lloyd Bridges was in and everything. I may do those once I get into my 1990s movie reviews, and that's the Hot Shot movies, Hot Shots and Hot Shots Part 2, with Charlie Sheen, if I remember correctly. But Lloyd Bridges had a long and very respected film and TV career. And I think for him, this was a nice change of pace and everything to do something comedic. And for those of you who might not make the connection, Lloyd Bridges is actually, if I remember correctly, he is the father of Jeff Bridges and everything, who's actually had a fairly decent career himself. But anyway, getting back to Airplane 2, the sequel. What ends up happening is they have to short out the computer, and they do that successfully. But instead of having Robert Stack return and reprise his role as Captain Kramer, we actually have a cameo by the one and the only William Shatner as the commander of Alpha Beta Base, which is one of the colonies that has been established on the moon. And to say that William Shatner did not prove once and for all that he is a very talented comedic actor is an understatement. Because he has some of the best dialogue, I think, in Airplane 2, the sequel. And if I remember correctly, the character's name was Buck Murdoch at Alpha Beta Base. And it turns out that Buck Murdoch and Ted Stryker had also served in the war and everything. They never say what war exactly, just the war. So it could have been some fictitious war, it could have been a fictitious war, or it could have been a real-life war. We don't know, but that's not really the point. Because Murdoch and Stryker's relationship is about as contentious as Kramer's and Stryker's relationship is. And there's another funny little moment and everything where Lloyd Bridges' character gets back into the flights, into the command center there at the Space Center. And he's on the radio with Stryker. And he's like, Stryker. And he starts snapping his fingers. He's like, Stryker. And there's a character standing behind him. And he says, because he realizes, Stryker. And the character, the other guy looks at him. He's like, and there's a woman standing right next to him, and he hauls off and belts the woman and knocks her down, because it sounds like Lloyd Bridges' character is saying, "Strike her." But ultimately, just like with the first Airplane movie, Stryker successfully lands the plane. He wins the day. Him and Elaine actually do get married this time, and hopefully they stayed married and they stayed together. But to kind of wrap this video up, as I've said, I don't think they could have gotten away with half of the humor in the airplane movies today that they got away with in the 1980s. But I think that's honestly one of the most appealing things about it, because it reminds us of I don't want to say a simpler time, but a less politically correct time. And I think that is one of the great things about comedy is, while it may not always age the best, it still reaches into the depths of the human soul and allows us to laugh at ourselves and laugh at the absurdity of the human condition. So, but that all being said, I hope you all enjoyed this video. It is one I've been wanting to do for a little while, but like I said, in a previous video, I've been sidetracked with a few other things going on within pop culture. And I will be getting back into Babylon 5 and into my pop culture of the 1980s and 90s. So, if you all haven't already, if you liked this video, if you had what I like to say, consider giving that, so consider subscribing to my channel, sharing this video, liking it, and yeah, all those fun things that every YouTuber says, but that's the game you play. And I'm okay with it because I'm actually enjoying this. I hope you all are enjoying this as well. So until next time, my friends, this is the Ambassador, signing off.